to welcome you all to Whitmore Catholic Church this Friday evening. We have the pleasure of having Dr. Edwin Noyes with us today.
Amen.
He's come all the way from Forest Grove, Oregon.
Amen.
And he's got a lot of good things to teach us about deceptions, and spiritualistic things in medicine. So I'm going to turn the time over to him.
Thank you.
And thank you for coming. Oh, one other thing. I'm going to send this around a clipboard, probably between meetings. Before you leave, get your name and telephone number and email. We'll start the email list so we can actually email out to people when we have programs like this.
Amen. Yeah.
When Tim invited me to come to Whitmore, I asked, where was Whitmore? I took my phone and put the address in. Not at the church, just Whitmore, California. Guess what came up? A post office,
That's right.
a store,
That's right.
and then it said the Seventh-day Adventist Church.
Yeah.
So I knew it was special. Coming down this road, we begin to wonder, are we mixed up? Are we going the wrong way? And then Linda here, my wife, says, look, and we saw this unique church. We're both grateful to be here. Thank you for the invitation to join with you. The purpose of the presentations that I do is to share with people the understanding that I have gained over 20-some years, actually longer than that, trying to find answers. As a physician, back in 1971, I began to receive many questions about certain type of healing practices that was coming into our civilization. Nixon went to China. When he came back, we heard more about acupuncture than we did about the political things. That was 1971. And patients began to ask me in the office about this, and I knew nothing. I wanted to give them an answer. My first impression was that the power of hypnotism and that was true, but I needed some solid answers so that I didn't have egg on my face later when something showed up. So I started a long study. I have not dealt personally in any of these things in practicing doing them. But over 20-some years of presenting seminars around the world on this subject, I have asked people, many of them that were deep in it, that have come out, is what I present correct? I have yet to find anybody to say, no, it is not correct, or any part of it. I tell you this simply that you may have a little confidence. I'm not one that was involved in it, but I have learned so I can share with others, and I'm simply here to share with you my understanding. And it came on arduous work, thousands of hours actually. Why the subject I'm here to explain and give understanding to spiritualistic practices. Why start with the story of our health message, which is our subject of this evening. I want people to understand and to realize and have a feeling that what God gave this movement, starting way back in the 1848, the first vision, that it has stood the test of time. It's in harmony with science. And it has put the Adventist denomination at this time like they've never been before in the eyes of the public. Well, you know what's best for a longer life. It is solid. And along came a counterfeit that's trying to undermine and take its place, that has no benefit, no history of benefiting the civilizations that it comes from. It's that strong. Let us proceed. I'm going to move through from the beginning of our story of our health message as told by D.E. Robinson. My freshman year of medical school at Loma Linda, D.E. Robinson, who had been the personal secretary for 15 years at Ellen White, taught a class, a religion class, came and went through the history of the beginning of how we got involved in all these things. So what I want to present to you tonight is some brief points of that history, so that you'll have a deep belief and understanding of what God gave us was from God, and it has been that valuable. Let's go back, way back in the Sumerian civilization, when they had a knowledge of God early on. Their health knowledge was rational. If we come down now 1,600 years later, at the time of the Exodus in Egypt, we have records, the papyrus writings, that tell us exactly what they did for their medical problems and so forth at that time. It was a mystical, had no relationship to reality, was not rational in any sense. But when Jesus took the Israelites across the desert, he gave them health instruction. Those principles that he imparted to them and is written in the Bible is truly the foundation of public health laws today. They were accurate. They came from God. In comparison with Egypt information did not stand the test of time, but that which was in the Old Testament, those particular things stood the test of time. They were built upon truth, God's physical laws. Now you remember this verse, and this came at the time they came to this pond of water. They were just thirsty, had none water for some time, and they saw these pools, and they were anxious, but then the pools were bitter. And God told Moses, cut a bush, throw it in the water, and it became sweet. And at this time, this verse is placed and said, if you diligently heed the voice of the Lord your God, and do what's right in his sight, give ear to his commandments, keep his statutes, I will put none of these diseases on you, which I have brought on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you. Now we go to the Bible, Deuteronomy. Remember, Moses was proclaiming to the people, telling them before he was to die, if you will obey God, you will be blessed. If you don't, you will be cursed. But here that book also recorded these sentences. Your garments did not wear out on you, nor did your feet swell those 40 years. Psalms 105. And there was none evil among their tribes. That would be nice, wouldn't it? Now we take ourselves down to the early Christian period. There were a lot of physicians that did writings in the early centuries of the Christian era, and they had some rationality to their understanding of disease, its cause, and how to deal with it. But that was soon lost when, at the time, in the church, the dominant church at that time, began to do away with, actually they separated the soul from the body. So the soul became immoral, never dies, and the body was worthless, it disappears. And so the care of the body was neglected, and forgotten. It was all, as medicine became mystical. In fact, it became so bad in the Dark Ages that medical physicians fled to the east, to Damascus, to Arabia, to areas where they did not have the church, because medical practice was outlawed under the pain of death. No surgery, no medical care. And the exorcism was done for healing, because everything was caused by spirits or demons, and it was a dark ages for sure. For 1,260 years, according to the Bible, but at least 1,000 years for medicine is concerned. And the actual medicine was banned in the 12th century under the pain of death. Then we had the Renaissance, where we began to have a bit of an enlightenment. Remember, when God's message is the knowledge of his salvation, story of salvation, began to die out of those times, along the medical care paralleled the darkness of spiritual darkness. And we're today at a great time of scientific enlightenment, but sweeping through is a darkness in the sense, and we're losing our spiritual light so much in this country And now sweeping through comes the counterfeit, the darkness of health and healing. We come up to the 19th century, and still there was very little knowledge of chemistry, physics, or physiology, no method of scientific investigation to ferret out the truth. Many concepts, many beliefs. Anybody that was strong-willed that could dominate people, his ideas seemed to supersede. Then in the middle of the 19th century began to be the mid-1800s. We learned that there were germs. Then there was anesthesia found. There was a bit of methods by which to scientifically investigate, to look for truth, begin to slowly come forth, and we begin to see some changes. But the greatest problem down through time was an understanding of what caused disorders of the body, what caused disease. There was many concepts, and treatments were parallel with the concepts, but there was very little truth in any of it. And that was the real problem. If you were sick, no water. Put in a dark, hot environment with no water, no fluids. I'm just giving you some ideas of some of the concepts. That is the mid-1800s. And the concept was that you had disease was because of an imbalance of fluids in your body, and bile and blood and sputum and so forth. And to treat and make you emit fluids, either vomiting or nose running or by bowels, would be toxic substance giving, supposedly to balance this out. And this is where the practice of mercury, arsenic, antimony, nicotine, strychnine, opium, digitalis, out of control. These were administered by physicians. This is what Mrs. White referred to when she spoke of drugs. Other medicines, not these metals, were called simples and compounds. But she referred to these things, and medical students at that time wrote to her and said, "What do you mean by drugs? Is it these things, these heavy metals?" And she said, "Yes, that's what I'm referring to as drugs." And that was a widespread use. They didn't know about bacteria. Eventually, about 1860s, that began to come along. I'm painting to you a picture of the knowledge of people, how they dealt with problems, compared to what we know was greatly different. They had no concept of how disease was spread through filth, the parasites from the animals, and that type of thing. I practiced in Thailand for a period of time on an island, and parasites was one of the big things I had to deal with every day. It was hookworm, all types of parasites, because of uncleanliness, because of the lack of hygiene. They had no knowledge of dietary things. And the winter come along, had salted pork, salted cabbage, all of these things. We didn't have the fresh vegetable. So different than we are today. To remember this period, they would preserve things in salt. Tobacco was prescribed for respiratory problems. Yes, that was common. Alcohol was everywhere. People had their fruit trees, and they had the cider that was hard and so forth. Coffee and tea were widespread usage. 12-hour day, 7 days a week. You see the picture I'm painting, this is the condition that things were in the early 1800s, 1840s, when this church began to have the people that got together, and by 1863 had formed the church. This was the type of environment, the type of thing they were living in. And then began to come forth some heaven-sent messages that begin to clear up some of this problem. One of the things was, it was expensive to have white flour. They had to sift it through silk screens till 1870, when it now, with the white flour, was just made available everywhere, cheap, and suddenly everybody wanted the white flour, and it was a status symbol to have it. But you know, the minerals and the vitamins and phytochemicals were removed, and people did not understand that. The medical treatment wasn't too great. I'm not going to hold up the medical science too well for that time. It was worthless, it was usually harmful and often deadly. But so along I come with an alternative, and not do the bad things that the physicians were doing then, and people did better. So whatever alternative was given, it looked like it worked. It got the credit, but the basic benefit came from not doing what so often was done. You know, makes sense. All right. Now let's take a little deviation here of the narrative. The sailors going to sea would be out there under very poor conditions, built and so forth, and they would develop not only scurvy, but they would get other diseases, infectious type diseases, and it was the pattern when that happened to take the sick ones and put them at the base of the ship where it was hot, damp, give them no water because, that would kill them. And this happened back there in 1777 in the ship, but they brought the sickest ones up on the deck. There were so many of them coming down with illness that they brought the ones they felt were not going to live to bring up on deck, and those sick sailors convinced them to throw water over them, just for comfort. Oh, they're going to die, so what difference it makes? They got well. But you think this knowledge would have spread? Didn't fit the narrative of physicians of the day. And so it was lost for 100 years or so. Now we have this young man over in Austria, Vincent Kuznets. He was 13 years of age, and he sprained his wrist, and he found cold water on there seemed to help him feel better. The Lord must have been leading him. Later he was injured in a severe accident, and he found cold water again was relieving things, and he gradually developed a business. Even worldwide, people and doctors would come from other nations to learn the hydrotherapy from Vincent Kuznets. This message eventually got around the world, got into this country, so some good things begin to arise too. And we all can go along with the use of hydrotherapy. It's not commonly taught in medical schools. When I took medicine, I had more than 100 hours of, we called it water. That was the class of water. But it was hydrotherapy, a variety of types. In the days when we didn't have the antibiotics, it was valuable. The antibiotics superseded it a bit, all right, it's still valuable. In fact, just this last week, I got an article that was placed in, I forget the journal, some medical journal, and it says, we went back to 1918 checking on the flu. Who were the people that had the best defense against the flu? And in this article, it says, what we found was a Seventh-day Adventist seminary where the disease was widespread, but no pneumonia, no death. This was the best results. So that was an interesting thing on that part. Well, you heard of graham crackers? And Sylvester Graham. I think God gave this man the message that eventually came to our church in health and healing. He was at Oberlin College, and he started whole grains. They had vegetarian meals for this college. That's the college Graham, what's his first name anyway? Billy Graham. He graduated from his son. Same college. But that was a vegetarian college back in the 1830s. I think God gave that man because what he had was exactly what he gave this body of believers later. Then, when the great disappointment came along, there was a small group of young people that continued to study. They knew that the Bible was true. Their understanding, they realized they had made some mistakes. And for 11 years, it was deep study. And the one young lady out there, God had begun to share with her some messages. The first vision on health came in 1848. Now, there was not a church yet. It wasn't until 1863 that we had an official church. But this group study was told by God, the message came, do away with tobacco, do away with coffee, do away with tea. Why? Its effect on the brain, the thinking. Now, it would take years before the tobacco would give you the harm of cancer of the lung and so forth. But it's a narcotic. These things affect the thinking. And here is a group studying to know the truth of the Bible. God wanted them to have clear minds. Don't dismiss this important message. 15 years it took for tobacco to be removed from the believers. God was patient. During this time, there were some believers that recognized the Bible prohibited the use of pork. And so they began to agitate it along with tobacco. God sent a message: leave it alone. I'll take care of it in due time. But don't agitate. This could have been upset and possibly even caused that small group to disband. God was bringing things when they could tolerate it and use it and apply it and not destroy the growing body of believers. The second health vision in 1854, 6 years later, what was that on? Still not a church, not till 1863. Well, cleanliness of home and surroundings, that wasn't the pattern. You got a bath once a month, of course, you get that tub in the house, you have hot water in it, and the first one in gets the clean water. The last guy in gets what's left. Some of you have that experience, or maybe old enough to remember. I had many years, that was all I had, even in the late teens. They'd take a bath in one of these tubs. I'd carry the water in a bucket and they'd heat it and pour it in. And it worked. It was better than nothing. But once a month? No, once a week for me. You see what they had, their living conditions were such that these things were not paid attention to. But God doesn't accept that type of thing. Avoid grease, which would be animal fats, the beef lard or pork lard. You know, if you go to Eastern Europe, and there you go out and they'll have their meat market outside, and there'll be huge tables full of chunks of lard, just that deep, high, packed. People take it and just drink it on that type of thing. And here came a message: avoid those grease, the saturated fats. Well, anything about saturated fats, God says, you know, avoid the grease, the animal fats. That's what it was. Third part, to use coarse grains and avoid the fine grains. We're not quite certain what that meant, but probably not to use the whole grain and not to refine, you know, the one that went through the silk screens, because the nutrients were removed there. All right? She says, I saw that God was purifying unto himself a peculiar people in whom he can delight. He will have a clean and holy people. I saw that God was not acknowledging an untidy, unclean person as a Christian. We're looking at these things so that when we think about what our church has been given, our believers have been given, the best hope message in the world, and along is coming out of the east a counterfeit, moving even into the church. I want us to be able to see the contrast, that the blessings we have, the benefit from what God has given us, versus the counterfeit that has no history of benefiting for millennia, those nations from which it comes. And yet it's come and been grasped by people like it's an answer to prayer. Back and going through yoga, those types of things. We'll get into them later. But I'm wanting us to have a foundation of which to make comparison. Our souls, bodies, and spirits are to be presented blameless by Jesus to his Father. And unless we are clean in person and pure, we cannot be presented blameless to the Father. General Conference, the first one, May 1863. 3,500 believers at that time, 21 delegates. And what happened 2 weeks later? There was worship in this house, and during the worship, Ellen White went into vision. And now she was given a great long message on health to start a sanitarium. But the most important aspect of it was for people and the believers to realize that their lifestyle, their practices of life had to do with eternal destiny. Critical to eternal destiny. For the mind to be clear so that it would choose and recognize what had been done for them on the cross. Things that they're in their habits and practices would dull the mind to not have the sense of what God had done for them. And so this was important. She says, I was again shown that our health reform is one branch of the great work, which is to fit a people for the coming of the Lord. It is as closely connected with the third angel's message as the hand is with the body. And I'm sure you people have this same conviction. God designs that the great subject of health reform should be agitated and the public mind deeply stirred to investigate. For it is impossible for men and women, with all their sinful, health-destroying, brain-enerving habits. See, I mentioned how it affects the brain. It says brain-enervating habits. It affects how we think. Why would we take those things? It's because it's an effect on the brain, for sure. The tobacco and the coffee and the tea. We don't take them just because it's liquid. That's that effect. And here she's referring to it. It's recognized to not be beneficial for our thinking. Now, the message was given, start a health reform place, a place where people that are sick can come. Oh, that was a tremendous challenge. See, that was 1863. It was 3 years before this began to be instituted. And so a health reform institute was started. And also a circulation of a health journal, one that had the messages of educating people. And this is the first Adventist sanitarium. Western Health Reform Institute. Well, you see people there walking around. And what is the treatment? What's going on? They're having a specific diet, quite different from theirs at their home. They're having some hydrotherapy. The building in the back has hydrotherapy in it, and exercise. And here we have the way in which Christ worked was to preach the word and to relieve suffering by miraculous works of healing. But I am instructed that we cannot now work in this way, for Satan will exercise his power by working miracles. God's servants today could not work by means of miracles because spurious works of healing, claiming to be divine, will be wrought. For this reason, the Lord has marked out a way in which his people are to carry forward a work of physical healing, combined with the teaching of the Word. Sanitariums are to be established. It's interesting. I just got the information the other day. The year 1901, at that point, we had 75 sanitariums scattered around. I know there was a lot in the Northwest here, several of them not there anymore. But the graduates out of the medical school of the American Medical College in Battle Creek, the graduates from there went out, and almost every one of them started a sanitarium someplace. Down through the south, we had up through the Northwest, a lot of them. You had a lot of them in California. It was easy to start legally as well as financially. It didn't seem to be so difficult. Angels will attend patients, helpers, and physicians to assist in the work of restoration, so that in the end the glory will be given to God and not to feeble, short-sighted men. Now, the Health Institute was to be an educational center, and there were to be no novices there. The musicians that were to work there were to have the highest training in the land and the schools. They were to do God's way, but to get their training the highest that the land had to offer, and no novices. What type of progress did we have? Well, we had the publication of the Health Journal, and then the Western Health Reform Institute. It had a lot of problems, but it did grow, and it later became Battle Creek Sanitarium. What was its therapy? Exercise, hydrotherapy, vegetarian diet, whole grains, nuts, no alcohol, tobacco, coffee, or tea. So the progress in the health message now, we had the Battle Creek Sanitarium in 1866, then a school of health. The first public health school, School of Public Health established, came from Battle Creek. Students would take 3 months and training, and then they'd go back to the churches to teach the churches. And if they decided to go to a medical school after that, they were given 3 months credit for training for those 3 months of public health training at the sanitarium. Very, very nice. And then in 1883, the School of Nursing, they needed more Christian nurses, and so they began to train their own. And the same for medicine, 1895. The college was called the American Medical College, and they had quite a number of students there. They continued up till about 1910, I believe, was the last year. We'll get into that story in a bit. And so in 1901, medical and surgical sanitariums across America, the mention I learned the other day, 75 by that time, and the nursing schools, almost all of those also had nursing schools. I had a chance, I was way in the interior of Russia for a time, presenting this very message. I had it all in Russian. And afterwards, people come up, can our students go to those nursing schools? How can we get our students? They were so almost in tears to think that we had a list of 54 nursing schools at that time, and they didn't have anything in that country for the Christian on that. And so it was so appealing to them. We come to that gentleman, John Harvey Kellogg. He was the gentleman that was the leading physician at the Dalford Sanitarium, a brilliant man. God blessed him and opened his mind, and he did a great work. And this was a letter written to him by Ellen White. My dear brother, as I have before written to you, I know that the Lord has placed you in a very responsible position, standing as you do, as the greatest physician in our world. Boy, I would have a happy fit afterwards. All right. A man to whom the Lord has given understanding and knowledge, that you may do justice and reveal the true missionary spirit in the institution, which is to represent truth in contrast to error. As you look to God in your critical operations, angels of God were standing by your side, and their hands were seen as your hands, performing the work with an accuracy that made the beholders surprised. Who has been by your side as you have performed these critical operations? Who has kept you calm and self-possessed in the crisis, giving you quick, sharp discernment, clear eyesight, steady nerves, skillful precision? The Lord Jesus has sent his angel to your side to tell you what to do. A hand has been laid upon your hand. Jesus, and not you, has guided the movements of your instruments. So we now show you a picture of that institution as it grew and became world famous. The rich and famous came there. It's a story of success. Oh yes, the cereal industry had its origin out of there. And the soybeans, actually, Dr. Miller was the man that really put them on the map, but he had gained his information first from that American Medical College. And he went to China and there began the work with the soybean. Now, I'm painting a great picture, and we're so happy to have seen that happen. But then some storm clouds begin to move across this history. Dr. Kellogg began to propagate for a number of years an Eastern philosophy. We call it pantheism. Mrs. White says it was akin close to pantheism. We now have a word that covers it. It's called panentheism. You see, pantheism says this great mystical cosmic power that had two sides came together, and when it did, became oneness and created everything. And that everything created has this power running through it. And that's pantheism. So everything is God. That power is called God, and everything is made of that power, so everything's God. That's why the Hindu has 330 million gods. And then they have one that's akin to it called panentheism. Says, yes, there is a living creator, and he is the creator, but he left divinity in you. You have a spark of divinity. That's what's sweeping across Protestantism today. And it's very popular. It works its way in a very deceptive way. So this is what Dr. Kellogg was doing. And it created a crisis. Actually, it almost did the church in. In 1899, the General Conference session was meeting, wondering what to do with this man, and they didn't. Ministers didn't really understand its basics, didn't really have a clear understanding. And while they were meeting, they received a letter from Australia, from Ellen White, that answered their whole, gave them the answers to their problem and explained it to them. Right on the very day. The theory that God was in all substance, air, food, water, that righteousness came by and by faith that God was in such, and we received righteousness by partaking of it. This cosmic power that's supposed to run through has immortality. So if you have it, you have immortality. Your spirit, your body that disappears, but you have an immortal spirit. That was the teaching. And the reason I bring this up in this session is because this is the core issue. The core issue of these Eastern therapies is power. That's the core issue. It's exactly what Dr. McCullough was bringing. We have here, now here's his word, here's how he explained it. We have here the evidence of a universal presence, an intelligent presence, an all-wise presence. And that word presence is referring to this theoretical power. An all-powerful presence, a presence by the aid of which every atom of the universe is kept in touch with every other atom. But this force that holds all things together, that is everywhere present, that thrills throughout the whole universe, that acts instantaneously throughout boundless space, can be nothing else than God Himself. What a wonderful thought, that this same God is in us and in everything. And then theism. This is what came on, created a tremendous division. We lost some of our leading men that went with Kellogg on this. Ellen White worked for many years trying to bring him around to understand. And so here's her comment about this. He called it the power, he referred to it as presence. She refers to it as essence. Have you ever heard the word chi?
No.
Same thing. There's 100 synonyms. You hear chi, we're talking exactly the same thing as Kellogg was talking when he said presence. Already there are coming in among our people spiritualistic teachings that will undermine the faith of those who give heed to them. The theory that God is an essence pervading all nature, or presence, or chi, or prana, or 100 other synonyms. The theory that God is an essence pervading all nature is one of Satan's most subtle devices. It misrepresents God, is a dishonor to His greatness and majesty. You know about the fires, the sanitarium burned down, the printing press burned down, and the General Conference moved to Washington, D.C. Battle Creek sort of disintegrated for that great center of Adventist gathering, shall we say. Battle Creek, the plans were made to rebuild. God said the message, build small. The number of sanitariums, but small. But you know what happened? The doctor wanted a big one, so he built a 1,000-bed hospital. It had 5 acres of mosaic marble covering floors. The architect that did the Supreme Court, I think, was the architect that planned this building. They went into huge debt. Now, to pay for it, he wrote the book. You heard about it, The Living Temple. He wrote a book that, in this book, he was talking about medical things, the living temple, the body, but he, all the way through it, wormed in this philosophy of Panentheism. And here's what Mrs. White said about it at the time. The Living Temple, a book that was written under the inspiration of the arch-deceiver. Who's that? Satan. So it was written under that inspiration. The sentiments advocated in Living Temple make this book a dangerous production. For in the book is taught an insinuating deceptive science of satanic origin. And I bring this to you so that you recognize when we get in later tomorrow, get into some of the specific type of therapies being done. It's the same power, the same deception. That's the basis of that. Unrecognized by most people today. The Living Temple by John Harvey. This book's theme was akin, close to, pantheistic concepts. So we now have panentheism as the word. The church publishing house refused to publish it. Dr. Kellogg had it published by another publisher. We learn more about it. The enemy of our souls is earnestly at work to introduce among the Lord's people pleasing speculation and incorrect views regarding the personality of God. The sentiments regarding the personality of God, as found in the book, The Living Temple, are opposed to the truths revealed in the Word of God. And she continues, we need not the mysticism that is in this book, The Living Temple. Those who entertain these sophistries will soon find themselves in a position where the enemy can talk to them and lead them away from God. In the book, The Living Temple, is presented the alpha of deadly heresies. The omega will follow and will be received by those who are not willing to heed the warning God has given. Or what we're going to be presenting, the omega, I'll leave that up to you. It certainly fits into the style that fits into the very subject matter, like it's a follow through. Many books have been written about what's the omega, and so I'm not going to make a proclamation, but my belief is probably a part of it. Be not deceived. Many will depart from the faith, giving heed to seducing spirits and doctrines of devils. That's in 1 Timothy 4:1. We have now before us the alpha of this danger. The omega will be of no startling nature. Okay, we had the 1,000-bed hospital built, the medical center, and the fires destroyed the hospital as well as the printing press. Battle Creek sort of disintegrated as the center for Adventism. Now, Dr. Kellogg continued teaching pantheism. The division between clergy and medical leaders widened, and in 1906 was the final separation. The medical institution went its own way, and blessings were withdrawn, and the church, the building, and the medical institution was not in the name of the church, and it was lost. 1901, Ellen White was shown that the medical institutions, other ones were to be developed, and in California. And down in Southern California, a conference of 1,100 people in 1904. In 1904, again, Paradise Valley and Glendale Sanitarium were started. How did that start? Well, let's look. Here's a picture. Up here we have Paradise Valley, and here's Glendale. At the late 1800s and early 1900s, there was a big boom in Southern California, and people from the West were coming out for health reasons, for spas and all of this, and a bunch of these were being built. But then a big depression hit the nation, and they went busted. So these were secured for a few dollars, and immediately were started as sanitariums. So here this Southern California had two on their hands, but then this little lady was saying, there's another one you need to get. What do you mean? We're to stay out of debt. And 1901, she saw in vision a special medical institution be established in Southern California. A great educational center would rise at this special institution. In 1905, Loma Linda was purchased. A man on his own, a minister, borrowed $1,000 and put it down because he couldn't pass this up. And she had seen in vision this place. And I'm showing you now the original institution. This is the front part. I had my meals in there for 2 years in this cafeteria. And here's the side from the other side. $40,000, had 64 rooms, immediately ready to go. I think they had around 400 acres. They had a deep well. They had a mile of walkways. They had fruit orchards. They had the railroad going right through the land. That was Loma Linda to start with. That was a beautiful building, wasn't it? Yeah. Okay, so we have now in 1905 it was purchased. Immediately they started the nursing school. And here we have this comment. The training is to be of the highest order, students to have the privilege of maintaining a living connection with the wisest of all physicians, from whom there is communicated the knowledge of superior order. There we have the first nursing group and the first baby. And Ellen White, a few months later, was addressing this, and she, being driven around the campus, says, I've seen this before. And her son says, no, you've never been here. She says, I've seen this before. That was the place. Hydrotherapy.
Amen.
We had a lot of fun in that. They're out for missionary work, the students.
Hey.
And at the microscopes, to the world they went. All over the world. Then the dental school in 1953 started. 1967, School of Public Health. Now we have in our denomination, I think 7 or 8 medical schools around the world. I know at least 2 dental schools. So things have changed. And some of the benefits of this knowledge, breakfast cereals, peanut butter was made popular, not first be totally found out it had been done years before in South America, but it was made popular. Meat substitutes, soy milk, and so forth. So the things the church had to teach and was using did spread to the world, and the world influence. We had the Stop Smoking Clinic, a very great thing that was started, remember, back in the 60s. Dr. McFarland and Alvin Falkenberg there. Then Dr. Mervyn Harding had registered taught the nutrition. And Dr. Harding, I want to get to in a bit. Here was a medical institution at Disneyland given to the church to operate. My nephew was head CEO of that at the time this picture was taken. And this was built in China. I've been at that hospital and talked there a little. That was built by a rich Chinese man, given to be operated by the Global Indus faculty and to teach the Chinese doctors the way. Here's the campus of Global Linda now compared to that other building you saw. That $1.3 billion hospital just went up that you see there. It's kind of blank on this picture. That was because they were going to be closed down on the hospital if they didn't build one that had the earthquake protections. Heart transplants, having a party, you know of that. Then Dr. Harding, his first study, he went to Harvard in 1948, came out with a study of comparing people that were vegetarians versus non-vegetarians. In this study, he separated the type of fats people ate and studied and showed cholesterol, and it showed from animal source seemed to raise cholesterol. The scientific world didn't pay attention that the Edwins were just as healthy as the rest of people, but they were interested in this cholesterol. And that began the great knowledge and interest around the world of looking at cholesterol forming this vascular disease. So that was the first Adventist health study. Now, every 5 years, there's an International Vegetarian Congress. They've had 7 of them so far. And it started out kind of being joked about and so forth, but today, it's number 7 when it had, a while back, 800 scientists attended from 34 nations. And they looked and saw the statistics that people that live this way have a longer lifespan, less problems, and they're interested. And so a whole food diet is popular now. I sat by a young lady that just finished her doctoral degree in London on whole foods. And I hadn't heard of that type of degree before, but it gives you an idea. It's taking over. There's a picture of this assembly. 800 people there, and reviewing every 5 years, reviewing the advances in the knowledge on there. Grains, fruits, nuts, and vegetables constitute the diet chosen for us by our Creator. And this is the most healthful diet. And that's what the top one is what they concluded at this Congress, and you see below, taken from Councils on Health, 115. Let me take a few moments to share with you this hospital I worked in on the island of Phuket in Thailand. I went there for a short season. Having a classmate had been there for 10 years, and their surgeon had left for some training, and they needed somebody in between, and I'd had a bit of training there, so I went, and this was a tropical paradise. We had a clinic 3 miles distant downtown. In that waiting room, you had a big well, and you dropped the bucket, and the kid that had the fever stood there, and you poured the bucket, you did hydrotherapy, right? The mother did it right there in the waiting room. That's this an emergency room. That was the days I had hair plus dark. I'll show you some. My son was 12 years old. One Sabbath morning, I needed to do emergency cesarean section, so I took my son with me and gave him the camera. So he takes the pictures, but then the anesthesiologist or the nurse anesthetist was not there, she was away, so I had to do the spinal anesthesia. And as I was doing that, he was taking the picture, he fainted. But I saved the camera. He got up afterwards and took the pictures, and so you see him a little blurry, he's still having trouble. This is the C-section opening here. The baby's coming out. And success. Here's a lady who had to amputate her leg. She has diabetes and gangrene of the lower extremity. This was a common problem there. Go back. That's quite a gap. Now, I'd never seen this surgical procedure done. And the other doctor, he didn't ask me if I knew how to do anything. He just scheduled it and they called me. So I went ahead and God bless. That's the next day and it's still got a scab there. How did I know how to do anything on that? Well, I found a little book, a surgical book there in the hospital, and it had a half a page telling you how to do this procedure. And then I looked at the author, and the author was a doctor back home that I called for helping me on some surgeries. He was in Portland, a famous head and neck surgeon. So when I got home, I told him to thank him for his work that had traveled around the world and helped me. Now, here we have a graph, and I closed this particular presentation with this graph. And one additional slide. On the left, I made this when I was going to Russia. I went there 10 times presenting this story. The first time I was presenting this story of a hope's message to the Russian pastors of an entire conference. This was shortly after the country had opened up, and most of these were young guys that hadn't been even Adventists more than 6 years, and now they were out as pastors. I knew they'd gone through the college there, but I doubted they had any knowledge of why we were following the vegetarian diet and this. And when I got through this, I spent a week with them doing nutrition training and so forth. They told me this presentation I gave here, they liked the best, because now they had a foundation to understand where all of this came from and why it came. So you see here on the left, the average Russian male would live about 58 years. His days of working was about 52 years. And over here to the far right, I would show that it would be the vegetarian SDA, a third more of life and a lot more working years. And if they would follow and pay attention to what I was going to tell them the next 3 days, that could be their experience as young pastors. And so this is where this particular presentation had its origin. And I was grateful for that. But I think it's important for us to understand it, because to God be the glory. Amen. I'll take a moment or two and I'll open up our next presentation here. I may need your help, sir. You'll get it back onto the next one.
Pause now.